The following program has language and content that may not be suitable for all audiences. Discretion is advised. This is an It's Your Break production, so sit back and take a break. Welcome to It's Your Break. I am Jonathan Mertz, and coming up in just a few moments, we're going to deep dive into the emotion of everything. And I'm talking about your own emotions, your anxiety, even your despair in some cases. And that can lead to panic attacks. So we're going to talk to an author who experienced all of this in her life. And it moved her to write a book. And it's all coming up next here on It's Your Break. Subscribe to the It's Your Break podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, YouTube, and iHeartRadio. Welcome back to It's Your Break. Hi, I'm Jonathan Mertz, and right now, we're going to deep dive into the emotional side of things. I am with Jennifer Juvenelle. Thank you so much for being on It's Your Break. And for people that don't know, she is the author of Daughter of Belial. Did I say that correctly?
You did.
All right, because I was before the interview, I was like so worried I was going to get that wrong. But you're on here for a different reason other than your book. And I had put out an interview request for people with expertise in panic attacks and what causes them and anxiety. And what we understand and what we see isn't always what we perceive inside and what goes on in our minds. And you have come through so much in your life. And I want to focus on that so that you can tell people how you got through these portions of anxiety and how you're still dealing with stuff today and how you're managing yourself, I guess. As I was still kind of lost for words for a second. I mean, to me, I want to tread lightly because this is a sensitive topic, you know, and I've dealt with it when I was younger too, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But let's start with you real quick. Can you give us your background and where you grew up, and it's kind of give us that little background first, and then we'll kind of go into some of the deeper details.
Sure. Thank you. Yes. So I have a very kind of, my early upbringing was very movement. There was a lot of movement. I was born in Hollywood. By the time I was a year old, we were living in Paris and then in Maryland when I was 3. And then we settled in Detroit when I was about 4 or 5. And that's where most of my upbringing was. I was abandoned in the womb by my biological father. And we may not realize it, but trauma can begin in the womb. You're absorbing your mother's hormones and emotions, and those affect the baby. And so as a child growing up, my mom remarried when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And that led to me being abused sexually by a friend of my stepfather when I was 9. That event is kind of the big trauma catalyst that eventually propelled me on a healing journey in my 30s. But before that, in my teens, when I was about 14, I had a lot of emotions, and anger especially hit me. But because I didn't have a clear memory around the trauma, or of the trauma, actually, I have a memory around it, but not of it specifically. I didn't know why I was so angry. I had a lot of anxiety. I had racing thoughts. I had all the symptoms, but I didn't know why. I just felt it. And when you're a kid, a teenager, you're kind of focused on other things like your popularity or your school or what have you. And I didn't have the coping mechanisms. So for a long time, I struggled in the dark, trying to figure it out on my own. I sought refuge. First, I had 2 suicide attempts, one at 16 and 17. Thankfully, they failed. And then when I was, right after that last suicide attempt is when I turned to alcohol and drugs for several years. And through all that, I was trying to figure out why I was in so much pain. I have a very inquisitive mind, and I've been very interested in the big questions. So I began studying spirituality. I began studying different modalities of how can I make the pain stop, essentially. And for many years, I went back and forth between seeking refuge and escapism through getting high, doing drugs, alcohol, and then kind of finding sobriety and seeking ways to get better. But the key thing is that I was always trying to do it on my own because I felt so much shame and guilt around what happened. I was embarrassed to talk about it. And that is kind of where my healing journey began and ultimately led me to Los Angeles and intuitively writing my book through that healing process. But I can get into some of the modalities, the healing modalities. But that's the early story. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So I'm going to focus in on a lot of that too. And so when you had that sexual predator come after you, what was your family's reaction in that instance?
So that's the tricky thing. My mom didn't know about it and didn't find out about it until I revealed it in my 20s later on, long after they'd been divorced. My stepfather, I lived in fear of my stepfather. He facilitated the abuse to happen. And I knew that at that time, my home environment was not a safe place for me to talk about something that had happened to me. So no one knew and no one helped me. It happened. And then I just carried on like nothing had happened, which was also very damaging and led to many years of denial. A big part of my healing has been actually admitting and accepting that the abuse did happen and that, although technically it's not okay, but it's okay for me to admit that, if that makes sense.
You really didn't have that basically relationship with your mother to really just kind of be very open.
I had a very close relationship. It's kind of funny. It's a paradox, because my mom and she passed away last year, and my mom and I were very close. And from a very early age, we did struggle later on. We went through all the things, and thankfully by the time she passed away, we'd reached a place of healing. But at that time, I did not grow up in a family that valued or honored emotional expression. On my mother's side, I come from a family that's very intellectual, very, very focused on being of service in the world, higher education, a family of doers, but not very experienced in feeling emotions, talking about, one of the maxims in our household was you don't air your dirty laundry. So it was not encouraged if there was a sensitive topic to really talk about that. It was kind of like you just get on with it. You put your head down and you get on with it, So that, no, as a 9-year-old, I sensed that, previously with the history of my biological father, and then I had an earlier stepfather who killed himself. There was secrecy and lies around the suicide. I was not really brought into that. So there was that whole thing that happened before this other marriage that had the sexual abuse. And I'd already learned as a very young child, if there's something that doesn't feel right, you don't bring it up because it might make the adults uncomfortable.
That's interesting that you say that and how that all came about. Looking back at my childhood, I've had a lot of childhood trauma. In the third grade, I got pinned between two vehicles, a van and a truck. It was in my own driveway. I was working on a piece of equipment. My dad had told me repeatedly, get out from between the cars. My younger brother was in the van, and my dad went to grab him and pull him out. He didn't want to, and he pulled on the old steer column gear shift, and it popped it out of gear, and hit me. So there is where a lot of my big anxiety started. I started to become a huge worrywart, things like that as well. Later in my junior year in high school, I had my lung collapse on me twice spontaneously. So every time I started getting after that a panic attack, I started getting hurt if I got a pain in my chest or at my back. And it just sent me into a tizzy, and I had to learn to really cope. I didn't go to see anybody. I don't know how I overcame some of that. I think it was just being able to understand that what I went through mentally, and I had to come to a self-realization on that part. And then, of course, later in life, I had a shellfish allergy. I didn't even know I was allergic to shellfish. I mean, I had eaten shrimp when I was younger and never had a problem, but later in life, I guess I developed it and had crabs, and it sent me into panic attacks after that. It started back up, but I don't know. It's different because I don't know how people overcome things. Some people go talk to people about it. Some people don't. Some people get into spirituality. What was your main method to kind of overcome your anxieties, your panic attacks?
Yeah. So initially, it was avoidance, which didn't work and doesn't work. And ultimately, I had to confront it. I had to look at it face on. The thing that I have realized, and that I'm still working on and realizing, is the power of our thoughts and the power of the ability of our thoughts to influence our bodies. And how when we have a trauma, whether it's a physical trauma like what you experienced, which can also, with the car, can include so many, like you said, you began worrying after that and having more fear. And it can also be accompanied with emotions like guilt or shame for not having listened to your father, or any host of things, how we internalize something. So really what happens neurologically is the traumatic event happens, and that creates it's linked to a very high emotion, which takes a snapshot. The brain takes a snapshot, and that's called a memory and of that experience. And then that becomes essentially a marker in your body for your memory. And you continue on into your life, but living in the past, remembering from that point on, the trauma that actually happened is over. But in your mind, through the power of our thoughts, we can call it up and recreate that memory over and over and over. And our bodies are objective, so they don't know that they're experiencing something that's in the past. It thinks it's happening now. And the panic attack is really, it's an automatic response when we go into fight or flight. And our body is sending out stress hormones and chemicals that are telling us that there's a danger, like a predator out there. So how did I overcome it? To overcome it, I had to overcome my physiological responses. I had to overcome my negative ways of thinking. I had to first become aware of them. That's the huge, huge component. I had to become aware of what are the thoughts, like those racing thoughts I mentioned. Once I was able to slow my brain down a bit, and I did this I tried different modalities. Honestly, I'm eclectic when it comes to healing modalities. I say whatever works for you. I take a bit of neuroscience and a dash of spirituality, really a big helping of spirituality. And my favorite things are the ones that blend the two. So finding help, finding someone, a support system, overcoming negative thinking, and really getting out of your way and changing behaviors, changing the behaviors that are creating that induced worry or anxiety. That's a huge one. You change your behaviors, you will change your life. And it begins with our thoughts. And I can give some actual practical tips on exercises that people at home can do, if you'd like.
Yeah, we'll do that in a second. But one of the things that when you were talking about this, it's so interesting because you can tell that you've had a chance to learn some of this. Now, you're not a psychologist, correct?
No, and I'm not a doctor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to say that too, but what I wanted to bring up is that it seems like you've done a lot of research or have been part of this and got the therapy to kind of overcome that. Where did that kind of fit in?
Yeah. So that started with, let's see, back in 2016, I started working for a relationship coach who had done a lot of work on herself and also had a background in neuroscience. And she is the first one who introduced me to this concept of changing your behavior, changing your thought patterns to change your life for the better. So then she introduced me to different things. I'm an autodidact. I love to read and research different things. I'm very eclectic. So I've been very interested in learning from people who are experts in these fields, who are doctors. I started there with the relationship coach, just working for her and absorbing her knowledge. And then she introduced me to Vipassana, which is a meditation. It's like a free meditation retreat. And I had the opportunity to go and do that. It's for 10 days. And that put me in touch with my body. And at that time, I had not really done any kind of therapy for my trauma. And I didn't even know at that time that trauma is stored in the body. So when I did that 10-day meditation retreat, it brought my awareness into my body. I could physically feel it for the first time. And once you have an experiential awareness of what is going on inside of you and what your body is actually feeling, then it's like an awakening. Something just clicks and happens. And I realized for the first time, I can't do this by myself. I need help. And so that led me to looking for a therapist. I wanted support in the form of one-on-one individual therapy. But I knew from previous experience of trying kind of your regular talk therapy that I didn't want the sort of traditional thing that I had experienced before that felt very devoid of spirit. So I made a list of the traits that I desired in a therapist. And then she came to me, like, because that's how the universe works. You start to make these changes in your thoughts. You start to put these requests and desires out there to the universe, and then you continue living your life. But you're starting to take different action steps. Those little things, it's like meeting the universe halfway, and then the universe will act for your highest good and draw to you those tools, books, people that you need for your growth. And so that's how I've worked, where I take kind of a half measure in the direction I want to go, and then synchronicity will bring a person to me. And I met my therapist. She's a somatic therapist who specializes in trauma. And that is for somebody who's looking for professional assistance to get through trauma or anxiety attacks and panic attacks. To me, they are linked to a traumatic event. It doesn't have to be physical abuse, like in a violence. It can be an accident, a car accident. It can be anything. But when something traumatic happens to you, whether it's emotional, physical, or all of the above, it is stored in your cellular makeup. And until you release it in your body, you won't be able to release it in your mind. So I do recommend working with someone, finding some kind of a help in that regard. And somatic therapy is a great tool for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. That is really, really interesting. That, it's interesting when people say they go out to these meditation retreats, they're really kind of weirded out in a way, especially if they're raised particular in certain faiths or things like that, because to them it's almost like, or what are we doing here? It's very, in that kind of superstitious type of mode. But how did you, when you got into that situation, what did you feel like when you first were starting to kind of just get into it? Did you go into it with an open mind? Did you feel a little uncomfortable? How did that work?
Oh, I'm the kind, I don't do half measures. When I decide to do something, I jump both feet in. So I was very excited. I went with the intention of having a transformative experience, and I walked away with a transformative experience. To touch on your point about meditation, Yeah, it does. I think there are certain things that meditation might be one of them, where people who are raised in very, very religious contexts or sects may have heard that it is one thing, or that it's aligned with one thing. And I know that, there are other, in the East especially, there's like lots of gurus who have their own meditation things. And this, what I did, Vipassana, it does come from, the East. It comes from India, and it is a teaching. However, I I don't have a guru. I'm a believer of you are your own guru. Uh, but I'm able to keep an open mind and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. Because just because some people may be assigning meaning to it, it doesn't mean that that's actually what it is. Really, what meditation is a way to quiet your mind. And when you have anxiety, that's exactly what you need. You need to get beyond your analytical mind and get into really what is 95% of us, which is our subconscious mind, the conscious mind that we make decisions with, and are operating our vehicles and going to work and doing all the tasks that we do, are driven by the subconscious mind. And it's 5% of the conscious mind that makes decisions and consciously chooses, I'm going to stand up or sit down. Meditation helps you get past the conscious analytical mind that's saying you can't do this, you don't want to do that, and get in touch with your subconscious, and which is your body. And once you get in touch with your body in a way that is not anxiety inducing. And what I mean by that, when you're in a meditative state, you're in a safe place. It's very quiet. It's very peaceful. There may be some nice music. Yeah, you're not in danger. You're not having that stress response. Your breathing will slow down. Your body will start to release chemicals that help you feel good. And when that happens, your brain waves will slow down. And once your brain waves slow down, then you're reaching a part of your brain where you can experience something different. You can experience peace, or up-leveled states, elevated states of bliss and joy and gratitude and compassion. And when you are in a state consistently of anxiety and fear and panic attacks, it's very, very important to learn how to bring yourself out of those states. Because as long as you remain in those states, that's all you will experience. And those are the experiences and the actions of the people and the experiences that you will attract to yourself. So they will actually feed as a negative feedback loop, and you'll recreate anxiety-inducing experiences. On the other hand, if you begin to cultivate a calm mind, a joyful heart, and you just start little by little, and meditation helps you do that, then you will begin to attract positive experiences and positive people, and your external environment will begin to reflect that new inner environment that you're cultivating.
All right, Jennifer. So let's go into some of these methods that you were speaking about earlier. So how can people themselves help overcome some of these, problems, whether it's a panic attack that's straight on, whether it's a little bit of emotional anxiety, something they can't let go? What are the techniques?
Sure. So I do want to preface by saying that I'm not a doctor or a therapist, and I'm simply speaking from my own personal experience of having been there. And these are tips, and you can take them or leave them. Of course, if anyone out there is experiencing really severe anxiety or suicidal thoughts, you should seek professional attention and help right away. So some things that really help me. The first one I want to talk about are morning pages or brain dumps. And this was one I stumbled upon. I wasn't even looking for help with my anxiety. I kind of was just living with it and managing it. But I had begun having, I would wake up in the morning kind of like, and then I would get on with my day. But I was sort of waking up with a start every morning, which was uncomfortable. And I just, separate of that, I started doing The Artist's Way. I think her name is Julia Cameron. And in that workbook, there is a technique, a tool in there called morning pages, where the idea is every morning before you start your day, you write out 3 pages of stream of consciousness writing. Doesn't matter what it is, just 3 pages, stop at 3, and just all the verbal diarrhea that is you wake up with, just put that down on the page and then put it away and don't reread it. You just leave it. So I started doing these pages every morning. I had a journal by my bed, and I'd just roll over in the morning and do them from my bed. And I did them for 6 months straight. And I kept doing them for that full 6 months because after about 3 months, I noticed that I wasn't waking up with a start anymore. I noticed that I was starting to feel better. I had quieter, like my mind was quieter. I wasn't worrying as much because every morning at the start of the day, all those worrying thoughts, all those things when we wake up in the morning and we come back to ourselves and we start thinking about our problems and the bills we got to pay and all the different things, I was getting them out first thing in the day. And then I could just take that into my day. Now, as a new mom of a 1-year-old, I don't have time to do those anymore. And and it is something you want to maintain. So I have adapted it to night pages. So for people who maybe it's not possible to do that first thing in the morning, I think I would like for someone to, or I could come back on later on and tell you, because I haven't, it hasn't been long enough for me consistently doing them to let you know how effective it is at night versus in the morning. But I think the important part is to do that stream of consciousness writing and make it a consistent thing and do it every day and do it for an extended period of time and watch the benefits that unfold.
That's fascinating. You know what's so interesting is that writing seems to be a tool for a lot of things, whether it's goals, whether it's, getting your emotions out. My son just now started doing a journal, and it's so fascinating that that's, part of your method.
Yeah, there is specifically handwriting. And I would add for these morning pages, you want to handwrite. You could type, but it's better to get off the electronic devices because there's something that happens in your brain when there's a connection between the mind and your hand. When you actually write it down on the page, it's like, that's why I call it a brain dump. You're releasing it. You're getting it out of yourself. And once you have it out of yourself, I think the mind relaxes because it's like the mind is like continually bringing it up because it's worried. It's like, pay attention, this is dangerous. And so once you write it down and you bring it to your conscious awareness, the subconscious mind can relax a little bit because it's like, oh, okay, she gets it. She heard me. I don't have to keep giving that alarm signal anymore. Writing is a huge, huge outlet. That is my biggest outlet. And actually, that's something I wanted to mention about journaling too. And a kind of a little caveat is how our greatest gifts come from our greatest gifts come from our greatest wounds. Because I was gifted a journal when I was on my 12th birthday. And that journal became my outlet for many years. When I couldn't talk to my family, when I couldn't talk to anyone, I got out all my anger and my thoughts and I hate this and that and everything on the page. And that eventually turned into poetry, which eventually turned into the book you see behind me. And I could never have known that wounded 12-year-old who started writing down her angry little thoughts and her hurt feelings would one day turn that into something like a full story, and finding a creative outlet is really, really important. It doesn't have to be writing. For some people, they might be more visual, painting. But who gave me that journal was my ex-stepfather. And that act, right before he divorced my mom and left us, and that act has always astounded me. I've wondered, did he feel guilty or what was that? But
Here, you're going to have some emotions. Be prepared.
Essentially, that's what that was. Yeah.
So. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, but that, it's interesting because when we were kind of starting this conversation, I was going to say, hey, I do want to tie in this book. And, I was going to bring up, I was like, man, she's got that placed so well in frame right now.
You can thank my husband for that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So yeah, absolutely. He's got that good setup there. And then one of the other things before we really go into this book, what is that sign that's behind you? What is that?
This one.
Yes.
That's also, so these were all my husband's. He was a huge traveler. He still is, but before he met me, he did like 55 plus countries. And I believe he got this in Laos. So it's different. I think they're I'm sorry, there might be Chinese or Japanese, I don't know. But so down here is the symbol for happiness. And then you have wisdom above it. And above that, there's tranquility. And then just out of shot, I can show you, is eternity.
Huh. That's really, really cool. And I'm going to say this, is you must be a great catch, because if he's traveled the entire world and in 55 countries and you're the one he ended up with, that is amazing.
Oh, thank you.
So think about that. I mean, seriously, all his opportunities he possibly could have had or came across, you're the one he chose, and that should make you feel special.
He's a wonderful man, and he does make me feel special every day. I feel very, very blessed. I had to do a lot of inner work to attract him, though, which is...
All right. Yeah, I mean, you weren't ready at one point, and then you got yourself there. I got you.
That's a fascinating story in and of itself, because I met him in 2015, right before I started really addressing my trauma. It was right before. And he wanted to get to know me. And I was like, no, why are you interested? But he was very persistent, and we became friends. And eventually I opened myself up to feeling worthy to receive love. I began loving myself first and foremost. And something just switched a few years ago. And now we have a baby.
That's awesome. That is awesome. You got all this thing happening in your personal life there, but let's go back and talk about that book, because that came from the trauma, that came from everything. Let's go ahead and I have not read it, and I hopefully maybe you'll send me a copy, and I would love to be able to read it.
Oh, I would love to. Yeah.
And but let's talk about it, the details, without giving away every little detail about it. But let's kind of go into really how that process came to be, what's in the book, and what can people expect.
Yeah. So I started writing the book in June of 2016, which was right. I always love the synchronicity. That was the year I started addressing the trauma, and I'm an intuitive. So I didn't know I was going to start writing a book. I typically, before that, sometimes I'd get some inspiration and I would write a little poem and just put it in a file, and that's it. And so it was a day like any other day. I opened up my computer. I was feeling inspired. I felt that brewing, like something needed to come out of me. I opened up a blank page, and a whole chapter just poured out of me. And I was like, what is this? I didn't know what I was writing. I didn't know what it was. I'm like, okay, I'm like, okay, that's weird. Is that a chapter? So that came out. And then the next day I wrote the second chapter. And by then I'm thinking, I start telling my friends and my mom, and I'm like, I think I'm writing a book, and I read them, the first two chapters, and I got some really positive feedback. They're like, that's really good. You should keep going. So I did. And the book is divided into 3 parts. And that first part, which is, originally it was 12 chapters and now it's 13. I did not know what the story was about. I did not know what I was writing. I just kept going. I would get the desire to write, and I would go into it, and I would put my hands on the keys, and I always called them divine inspiration. And then the words would flow. And that's how I wrote the entire book. It wasn't until the end of part 2, which was the end of part 1, which was probably about a year and a half. I wasn't writing consistently. I wasn't like waking up every day and doing this. It was really when it came, and I was addressing the healing first and foremost of the trauma, and working on making my life into something that I enjoyed and didn't give, because I had started having panic attacks in public. It got really, really bad. I'd be sitting in a restaurant and sitting at the table, and all of a sudden I'm hyperventilating and I have to get up and leave because I'm about to start hyperventilating. It was really, really bad. So through that, I had my whole journey and was seeking different modalities and went on the meditation retreat and then started working with the somatic therapist and actually releasing things. And it was after I was also doing energy healings, which are really important. And it was after a soul retrieval that I worked with a healer, an energetic healer, and then had followed that soul retrieval up with a session with my therapist where we completed it and really rescued the wounded child. It was that in particular that when I went in to start writing in the book and felt like something else needed to come through, and it just came out from my wounded child exactly what had happened to me, and as a 9-year-old, but in a kind of a poetic, sort of a creative way. And I knew that it was true because I had a physical reaction to it. I started crying, but not in the sense of crying like when you're reliving the trauma. It was a release of crying, like letting it out finally. And when that happened, I simultaneously realized that I was writing a story about child sexual abuse and pedophilia rings. And I got so scared because I knew if I wrote a book about that, then I would have to come on a show like this and tell my story and talk about it. And at that point, I hadn't really told anyone about what had happened to me other than my therapist and my mom, very select few trusted individuals. It was terrifying, but also really healing. And I kept going. I kept writing the book, and it's the first in a series. And it's gotten some great reviews, which I've been feeling really grateful for. People seem to be enjoying it, and people take, it's entertaining. It's not nonfiction. It's a fictional story, but I poured my heart and my soul into it. And the writing of it was a major outlet that followed me on my journey, and it was written intuitively. I didn't know the ending before I wrote it, and there were many times when I thought, oh gosh, I hope this makes sense. Does it make sense? And I was very happy to see that, oh wow, it's a coherent story. It makes sense, and people like it.
Well, they always say that you should write what you know, right? And I think some of the best stories ever have always came from parts of truth, or even whole parts of the truth, but also it mixed in with the fictional story. So, I mean, because that is experiences you did firsthand, you lived firsthand, that can be reflected easily. So I think those always do come across very well.
Thank you. Those have always been my favorite fictional stories too, the ones that resonate, that have that nugget of truth in them. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So if somebody wanted to actually get your book, I'm going to let you promote here. How can they find out? How can they find out about you and all that?
Yes, the book Daughter of Belial is available on Amazon. It's available in ebook, paperback, and hardcover. You can get in touch with me personally through my website at jenniferjuvenelle.com. You can also get in touch with me on Facebook. I have an author page, Jennifer Juvenelle Author, and I'm on Instagram at jjuvenelle.
I thank you so much for answering my interview request that I posted out there on this forum, and having somebody to come out and that really is willing to open themselves up, because I think sometimes hearing from specialists are great, but hearing the personal connection makes it more real to somebody that, hey, if they can overcome things, so can I. It gives them an inspiration.
Thank you. This has been so fun for me, and I love your questions, and it's been really a joy to talk with you. So thank you.
This episode of It's Your Break was not a paid advertisement. The thoughts and comments of the host or guests are those of the individual speaking, and not necessarily that of It's Your Break or Spark a Vision. Follow Jonathan Mertz on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at Jonathan Mertz. Follow It's Your Break on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram at It's Your Break. Subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, YouTube, and the iHeartRadio app. This episode of It's Your Break was hosted, announced, engineered, edited, and produced by Jonathan Mertz, and was recorded and produced at the Spark of Vision Studios. All sound effects were obtained through Sound Ideas, Pro Sound Effects, iStock, Avid, and Spark of Vision. It's Your Break is owned and distributed by Spark of Vision. Copyright It's Your Break. All rights reserved.